Howdy, folks. This is Anders, and today we're going to be talking about what's basically step one in 3D printing. We see a lot of questions on the board of people who have gotten new 3D printers, and they're like, "Well, I loaded the STL file onto my drive, and my printer can't read it." And part of the reason for that is that your printer can't read an STL file. It needs to go through a slicer. So what is a slicer? A slicer renders an STL file into layers that are readable by your machine. So now why do we want layers? Well, because that's how your printer operates. So one of two things is going to happen. If you're in an FDM 3D printer, which is sort of your standard 3D printer that everybody thinks about, the build plate starts at a level, works its way down, and plastic squirts from a nozzle onto it, and it builds from the build plate up. Or in the case of resin printing, your model adheres upside down to the build plate, which slowly dips the build plate into the resin and cooks a layer on at a time. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So first, what we want to talk about is slicer software. The chances are really good that the slicer that came with your printer is fine. It's okay. It's not great. It's in fact, as a beginner, you may actually find it really frustrating because they don't tend to throw a lot of features into those freebie slicers that come with your system. So you're going to want to hop online and get a free slicer, and there's a ton of them out there. The Prusa slicer works fine. Chitubox works fine. I use Lychee slicer, and I'll get into why I made that decision in later episodes. But there's tons of free options out there, and you'll find everybody will basically tell you why theirs is better than the next guy's, and users are going to support that. I recommend finding the one that works for you. So in these lessons, we're going to keep the content fairly generic and talk about things that will work for every possible slicer out there. So getting back down to business. What you're seeing here is you're seeing the underside of your build plate for a resin printer. And we're going to talk about resin because it's sort of a little bit more complex than the FDM slicing. So this is really a good one to use as an example. So what you're seeing here is you're basically seeing a model that's attached to the build plate. And so this is what the model would look like in its finished format. And the slicer is basically going to print one slice at a time as it works its way from the bottom. So the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to cook this onto the build plate with the base layers, which cook a little bit longer. And then it's going to go one layer at a time, and it's going to slowly build its way up. And that build plate is going to go a shorter and shorter distance each time, and it's going to build, and it's going to build, and it's going to build. And what we see right here, this is an island. And this island is not attached to anything. So what's going to happen is it's going to float off into the tank unless we support it. So you have to support your models. And it's not always the case, but we're going to talk about that in several episodes later. So just remember that for future episodes, because this is going to be more about how to set up your system. So now that you see what's going on, how it's basically printing a layer at a time, and it's making your models, and it's making islands, which we're going to discuss later, and then eventually it's going to stop dipping, and you're going to have this awesome paladin, I guess, guy. So let's talk a little bit about what you're going to have to do to set up your slicer. So there's two things that you're going to have to do when you get your slicer set up. Is number one, you're going to have to set up for your printer. And so in this case, I have mine set up for my two resin printers. I have an Anycubic Photon and an Anycubic Mono X. And there's pre-made profiles in just about every type of slicer. The chances are really good it supports your printer. If not, you can go in and make a custom one where you're going to want to define the size of your build plate. So if you look at this, I'm set up for my Mono X right now, which is gigantic. But if I go to my Anycubic Photon profile, you'll see now that the build plate is a lot smaller. So now that's set up to go onto the Photon, which has a smaller build plate. The other thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go in and you're going to want to set up your resins. So for example, if I go to my Mono X, I'm using a standard gray resin, rapid gray, set to 0.04 millimeters per layer, which is okay for like tabletop miniatures. A lot of folks go down to 0.02, which is great detail, but of course it takes a longer time. So that's entirely up to you. And then you're going to set up the profile for that resin. Now, the chances are really good that the manufacturer is going to have some recommended settings for those resins. I'm going to talk about why they're normally wrong and how you're going to want to tweak that for your personal printer and to understand the effects of resin that's set up incorrectly, and what to look for if you're cooking too hot, not cooking enough, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll talk about that in another episode. So for now, we have two key takeaways for why you have a slicer. Number one, you need a slicer so that your printer can interpret printable files as layers. And number two, your slicer needs to be set up for your printer and the resin that it's using. So with that, we're going to leave off and we'll get into deeper details on that a little later. So thank you much and hope you learned something. Take care.